So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the green energy revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
Today, we're joined by Michael Entner Gomez, an executive consultant and market strategist. He's been a digital transformation leader at companies like Cognizant, PwC, and Verizon. He pioneered software defined vehicle architecture, impacting multiple industries and contributing to Wind River's acquisition by Aptiv PLC to the tune of $3.5 billion. Beyond tech, he's a writer, speaker, and environmentalist focused on sustainable innovation, financial models, and strategic ecosystems. And finally, he's also a lover of Italian cars. So kudos to you. Michael, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Michael, that was quite an introduction. I'm super impressed. Why don't you just back up a little, talk to us about your journey to how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So my background formally is in enterprise architecture and software engineering. I've been working in the tech field for way longer than I wanted, probably 20, 30 years now. About 10 years ago, I started making a pivot away from the technology and more towards really working with business to achieve business outcomes. So what is it you want to actually have happen? How do we take the technology and back into it? So I started doing that, was very heavily involved in energy, utilities, manufacturing, telecom, and got involved in automotive over the past 4 or 5 years very heavily. But I've always been an automotive aficionado, build motorcycles, build cars, doing anything I can to get my grease to work. But I don't have the typical pedigree of a typical automotive person, but I bring some background.
No, but I think it's pretty neat, though, obviously, with your tech background. And as we all know, software defined vehicles, this is the direction where we're all going. And the
Mm-hmm.
fact that you truly are an automotive aficionado, and I know Moto Guzzi seems to be a brand close to your heart, that speaks volumes. So, in my book, you've got a lot of cred over there. You've got a very active Substack where you're a prolific writer. And a recent article that you posted really kind of caught my eye. It was the State of Automotive Industry 2025, 10 realities that we can't ignore. I'd
Hmm.
really like to kind of dive into that because we're at such a crossroads right now. And I think your take is very fresh. And once again, taking the bird's eye view of where the automotive industry is right now, there's a million different directions we can go in. And I think you have a very interesting take. Let's start with the elephant in the room,
Okay.
Tesla.
All
Tesla's
right.
market
That's
influence.
always a fun topic.
You can't ignore it, right? So,
Mhm.
why do you think that Tesla remains dominant despite all the controversies?
Well, yeah, I mean, Musk is a colorful character. He's been getting involved in politics. He has various interests across the board. We could probably spend a couple of hours talking about the politics. But I mean, the reality is that Tesla was the market leader. They really pioneered the space, but they're facing a challenge, which really, this is not something that I think most people anticipated this would happen, is a saturation of the market from other companies producing EVs. So at some point, you're going to deal with multiple companies bringing EVs to market. The choices are wider. It's not just your, forgive me for saying this, but the Tesla blob. The engineer will come after me for saying that, or the designer. But you have
Mhm.
choices now. You have more traditional type vehicle. Even though Tesla's gone to extreme with Cybertruck, you still have other options. So that's part of the problem. And then when you look at the international market, they're obviously the Chinese threat, and that's a very real threat. I talk about Chi-Fi all the time. I'm an audio guy, and what we've seen is a decimation of the market, even in other areas like audio, where we
I
used
was
to
not
have.
aware of this. Talk to me just a little more.
Yeah,
We'll do a quick side note on that. I had
yeah,
no
yeah.
idea that they were eating into the audiophile space.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You look at companies that traditionally sold very high end, like Macintosh and other companies that really brought, $3,000, $10,000 amplifiers to the marketplace. And the Chinese companies have gone back, resurrected old designs. They've copied existing designs. They've improved on them, innovated on them, and now are able to bring products to market much cheaper and much faster. I mean, even behind me, and forgive my mess here, we're in the middle of moving, but even if you look down there at the bottom of that little table, we have an amplifier for a headphone set. And that amplifier would have normally been a $4,000 or $5,000 amplifier, and I bought it for I think $500.
Wow.
So, and it's beautiful and it works great, and you can put Russian tubes in it or whatever makes you happy. But the reality is that that's going to happen in every market. We also see companies like Ween bringing streamers to the market, where you had $2,000 and $3,000 high-end audiophile streamers to bring digital audio, or Spotify. We're seeing a streamer in the $300 price range now, companies like Ween, and that's because of the ability to produce in China. And those products are now displacing $2,000 and $3,000 streamers. You see people with very high-end $20,000 gear setups, and they have a $300 streamer sitting there and it's great and all. So this is not unusual. I mean, this is happening in every market. I think automotive is just the most recent one to touch.
And it's interesting. It's not so much just about cheap labor, right? That used to be
Huh?
their advantage, right? We shipped
Yep.
all of our manufacturing over there because things are just cheaper. But it's gone beyond that now, right now, right? This is truly the advancements in technology is really their advantage. It's a sea change. It's
Yeah.
incredible. And I wonder how long we can keep these products out of this market with tariffs.
Yeah, I don't think the cars. I've made mention of this. I don't think the Chinese cars or EVs are coming anytime soon, especially with the administrative change we've seen in the White House now. There is a real push against those vehicles showing up. They were even trying to bring them in through Mexico. You know that
Yeah.
squashed as well. The big challenge you're going to see though, I don't even think it's in the tariff part. This is this is something we brought up a while back, and it's come back to rear its head. That's being leveraged now. Is the cyber security aspect. We saw this stuff with TikTok, and that's still in motion.
Yeah.
But I think even a couple of years ago, I was saying that what you've got with new automobiles is essentially an espionage kit on wheels, and whether it's used
Oh
for
yeah.
that or not, right? I mean, but it tracks where
Uh,
you are, what you're doing. There's cameras, sensors, audio input. Got it, right, Scott?
Well,
yeah, I
no
mean, you
more
have
than the
to assume that all of that tech is being used against you when it's coming from China. I hate to say that, but I mean, Rob, you and I dealt with this with DJI,
yeah,
with the
yeah.
drones. It was the exact same thing we were dealing with, back when we were dealing with drones. It's
Well,
exactly the same. So no, I agree with you completely that it's going to continue. It will continue to be a cybersecurity issue as we
reminder
move
that this
forward.
this thing over here is probably the greatest cybersecurity threat.
It
We've
is.
already let
Oh,
them into
got it. Yeah, they're already there. Well, I
our
mean,
backyards already, so what difference does it make at this point?
that's true. Well, I was
Well,
even
but
mentioning.
no, now you're talking about the benevolent Google gods that would never do anything bad to you, Rob. They're
Do
so
no
nice
evil,
and
right?
friendly, and they have sheep mowing their lawns, and it's not the
Oh,
evil
boy.
China, right? It's
All
a
right.
different beast.
Well,
Very
let's
true.
let's let's pivot back, though, to the software-defined vehicle. Michael, you're a pioneer in this space here.
Mhm.
Is this the holy grail? Obviously, all the Chinese cars are software-defined vehicles. Almost none of the American cars are, save Tesla. What's going on here? Is this truly a panacea? Is this the direction we need to go in for the EV market to basically be resurrected, right? We're in a little bit of a slump right now. Is this the secret sauce of what it takes to get consumers to finally buy in and say, I need an EV?
That's a loaded question. That's complicated, but I'll try to break it down a little bit. So, software-defined vehicle is just kind of a natural evolution of where we're going with that, right? The ability to develop, deliver, and continuously operate software whenever you want to do it on whatever device you. And so the way we do that is by modularizing the software and delivering it to a vehicle or some other device in a piecemeal fashion, but continuously being able to update, continue to improve it through iteration. So the what we're seeing in automotive is that I'll give you an example. I'm still running around. I love my truck. It's a Ford F-150, 2016. I don't think the software has ever been updated. And I mean, I don't remember. Maybe if we took it to the dealer and they did something, but I can tell you for a fact that the software is buggy. It runs wonderful Microsoft Sync, which I'm not a huge fan of. But my, Apple gear very well. It desperately needs updates, but it can't get them. And this is where we get into when we start talking about software defined vehicle, the ability not only to update that software, because that's kind of a given, and you can do that in most vehicles nowadays with what we call over the air updates. You can update stuff as you go, but the ability to swap out whole chunks of code that do particular functions or provide particular functionality, that's where we're kind of heading towards right now. Um, And there's another piece to this. People tend to ignore this. They talk about SDV and varying levels. SDV, they're starting to apply level for autonomous driving. And I think that's a good concept because you're going from very basic software updates to full functionality swap outs. But the reality is that this is very limited by the OEMs. The OEMs do not want to, I always this term is a little bit vulgar, but open the kimono. That they don't want to open the kimono. They don't want to let people, look at their code. They don't really like the whole idea of code being updated all the time. It gets into safety and certification issues. So while SDV it's important, it's the way we're going to update and run the software in the vehicles. It's going to take a long time for that to be adopted.
And when you say a long time, you're talking about years, decades? What are we looking at?
I mean, we're seeing companies right now that are doing software defined vehicle, but you have to define what you're talking about in software definition. Is it you have basically a blob of a car that doesn't do anything until you deliver software to it, and now it's defined to do certain things? Or are we talking about certain functions that have been kind of abstracted out from the hardware into software? And I guess so. Let me back up a little bit. Instead of actually putting hardware that does certain things, very specific chipsets, we're looking at how do you take commodity processors and then run software that you want to run on those things without worrying about what's under. That's what we call software abstraction. But the idea is, I think, to answer your question, I think we're at least 5 years away or 10 years away even from full adoption. Although companies like Tesla, companies like BYD are already kind of pushing ahead in that space. But full definition, and this is another question we get into, what can you really define as software? Because we are talking about electromechanical, like real, like physical things that happen in the real world. So software is important. It's part of the equation, but so is the physical hardware that goes along with it.
I mean, the other thing I would say about that too is if you look at the traditional OEMs when it comes to computer technology in more traditional cars, everything was completely disconnected. I mean, you had a computer that was running the engine, you had a computer that was your navigation system, you had a computer maybe tied to your climate control, to your phone, to whatever. They were all completely disconnected. There was no network connectivity between these devices in prior types of cars. So you're talking about having to first convince a traditional OEM, okay, you need a meta computer, not the company, like a meta layer,
Right.
to control all of these individual components that you are then going to allow software to drive. And once you've convinced them of that, then you want to also convince them that you can do regulatory compliant over the air software updates to those components. Now, one thing I'll say that I do think will happen with the current administration is that some of those regulatory restrictions and confines will start to get stripped away to drive innovation in the background. I think
Right.
part of what Musk is going to try to do, maybe while he's, standing behind, rubbing the guy's shoulders in the Oval Office, is, whisper in his ear and say, does it have to be this complicated for me to build a car?
Right.
But let's be honest, because again, we talked about this briefly before. His aim is profitability, right?
Yeah.
Especially with Tesla, he's trying to make money. Those regulatory, strongholds make it more difficult for him to be profitable. And if he can kind of massage that into a more simplified process. But I think, Michael, your point is massive. You're trying to convince these traditional OEMs who are not computer guys to be computer guys now. It's going to take ages.
It's tough enough just to convince them to let Apple CarPlay into their
Yeah,
walled garden.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
ages.
Yeah, that's the challenge. So it's gonna be tough. And you see companies that are right now trying to roll out these software defined vehicle suites. I was part of that at Wind River, is that we actually wanted a complete holistic system that you could use to develop, test, deliver, continuously operate. But that's a pretty big play. It's a pretty big chunk for an OEM to digest, and they don't want to let go. They don't want to lose control over that stuff. So to me, at the end of the day, you have a framework, but how much of that framework will be adopted? How much traction can you get? And to your point about government regulation, in countries like China, they are more aligned with what the government allows them to do a lot more. They can go out and test robotaxi. They can go out and test new software updates. And if somebody dies, you know, I don't know how how that affects things. Here in the United States, somebody dies, we stop it. So,
Yeah. And, it's interesting, just from more of a bird's eye view here. What I do believe is that obviously, as we discussed here, the OEMs they're kind of dragging their feet and they're in no rush to truly kind of convert over. But I think from a consumer perspective, when you get used to driving in a software defined vehicle like a Tesla, the technology is so leaps and bounds ahead of all other vehicles that suddenly when you get in your old car, it seems like you've stepped back a decade. It reminds me of the old days when the first iPhone came out, and a smartphone, no one really knew what a smartphone was, and no one knew what an app store was. But as soon as you got a taste of that, you took a look at your flip phone, and the only thing about your flip phone that was
They're
the
small.
value proposition was small. That
Yeah.
was it. And then all of a sudden you're like, "Who cares? I want my phone to do things."
No,
And
they even
it's
fixed
hard.
that. Yeah, Rob, they even fixed that. My wife carries a Motorola flip phone, right? It's a smart folds in half. So we even got the form factor. But yeah, you're right. It's like taking a step back. And you were talking about the hi-fi equipment earlier. I've got hi-fi equipment that is tube. So you stick tube them, comes from different places and you can see what sounds better. But that technology compared to what's available now, very small, what they call Class C amplifier, which power huge speakers and costs $100 and get software updated on a weekly basis, you know, it's like a step back to the Stone Age. It really is.
Yeah, yeah.
I think one thing that will push this forward, just one last quick thing, and Michael, I'm
Yes,
curious your
Scott.
thoughts on this,
Yeah.
is the vehicle to vehicle communications that's going to come with autonomous vehicles. Because I
Mhm.
think you're going to have to build a standard for that, V to V, V to X kind of situation. There's going to have to be a standard developed, which I think will push all of the traditional OEMs forward. But yeah, curious what your thoughts are on that.
That's a really great one. I always kind of pull this analogy out. Imagine a flock of birds that are flying and they can't communicate with each other. And they basically start running into each other. There might be one leading. It just doesn't work. That's where we are with automotive in my mind. We have maybe a small percentage of vehicles that might have the capability to do vehicle to vehicle communication or vehicle to infrastructure communication, right? The VX. And there are standards that are being defined, but in reality, you need this swarm mentality. What I call swarm mentality. You need to be able to have all the vehicles talking to each other. And that percentage of vehicles on the road that is new might have these capabilities, assuming the standards don't change, is very small. So while it's great, and I've been to conferences at ITS, like the College Transportation Society, you have situations where there are people putting great tech out there, but it's not really going to get adopted quickly. And you know what? This is the worst part of it. A large chunk of that depends on the federal government. They have to funnel money into it and
Oh,
make it
forget it
happen.
then.
Yeah,
Ain't
I
gonna
mean,
happen in that case.
that's what I'm saying. So, I mean, you have companies that are putting out really cool products in the space. And I've worked with a few of them, but I just don't think the technology is going to get adopted widely. I mean, I'm not saying it won't happen. It could be 10 years from now. We see
Yeah,
the
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I
cars
think
pop
that's way
out.
in the future. It reminds me in the aviation world of ADS-B. That's a
Yep.
standard that was developed about a decade or so ago, where all airplanes in the air all communicate with each other. You
Uh-huh.
you obviously have radar, you have air traffic control, but when you're in the cockpit, you can see everyone else because all the commercial aircraft are communicating with each other.
Yeah.
And it's a superior technology for a safety perspective. It's something that would be awesome if all cars had it, but once again, I think without the federal funding and the federal government really behind something like this, to develop a standard and to mandate it, I agree with you there. It's going to be at least a decade away, if not 2 decades away.
Right. And all the
Like this
companies you see
happening.
working with it, they are lobbying hard.
I think there's a time and a place for the federal government to get involved, and this would definitely be one of them. But with this
Yeah.
administration, I just don't see that happening.
Probably not at
No.
this point.
Let's pivot real fast to affordable transportation as a service. This is
Mhm.
something you discussed in your article. I think a lot of people don't even understand what that really means. So why don't you just kind of run us through that and real quick and explain what that really means to the to the consumer out there who drives a car or
Sure.
does not drive a car.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I get this like constantly when I start talking about anything that's in the advanced realm of automotive. The common comment that comes up is, well, we probably won't even have cars. And that to me, I mean, that is kind of the holy grail, of transportation as a service where you don't own a vehicle. So let me backtrack a little. The transportation as a service, what it means to me, it can means different things to different people. But To me, it means the ability to not own a vehicle. And I am able to get a transportation service to wherever I want to go, whenever I want to go there, accommodating whatever, mode of transportation I need, traveling gear, hauling gear, whatever, but just not having to have that ownership portion. And I don't see I just don't see it. I see it in some places, like in the urban environments, we see, the ability to rent scooters, like right, renting scooters, e-bikes. We see the opportunity to ride mass transit. And there are people that in the cities, in fact, and you all know this very well, that don't need that type of, ownership. But once we get out into the real world, and not that the urban environment is not the real world, but once we get out into the outer lying areas surrounding the urban environment, it breaks down tremendously. So transportation as a service, come back to, can I get where I need to go, take things where I need to take them, when I want, how I want, and this is the caveat, at an affordable price. Because I mention this all the time. I tried to get the other day just from the airport. I came back from Italy, wanted to get a ride to my house, 7 miles, $50.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sit with me. It doesn't sit well. So hopefully that explains it.
So is this where Elon Musk swoops in to the rescue with the robo taxi?
I don't know. The challenge we got, you've seen with things like Waymo, is that those vehicles are very expensive. They're loaded up with LiDAR and sensors.
So that's exactly why Musk went in a different direction, right? He
Yeah,
just went with the cameras
yeah,
for that reason specifically.
yeah. And they've been criticized. Tesla's been criticized for doing that, saying you can't get a full, complete picture of what's going on around you and everything else. But the reality is, if you want to have some type of sustainable model that actually works, that is affordable for people, you have to go down that path. I think you have to go with a lower common denominator for sensor inputs, and that's where you get into the cameras. I mean, there's an opportunity to bring other sensors in and kind of bring it together, but that's where we're heading. So you look at Waymo; they're making huge investments. You see, GM dropped out of Cruise. I did some work originally with Motional, where Aptiv dropped out of that too, with the joint venture with Hyundai. It's a very expensive pursuit. So when you actually do someday, let's say you can get rid of drivers and you have the robo taxi experience, I'm going to ask, can I get a ride to the grocery store for under $10? And while somebody might
I
debate, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think no. I think what you'll end up with is a much more profitable Uber that's still charging you
Yeah,
the same price because you've been conditioned
yeah,
to pay the same price. Listen, I completely agree with you in terms of transportation as a service in places that aren't densely populated. If
yeah.
you live in the suburbs of Minneapolis, yeah, transportation as a service for you is not going to be great and not for a long time. And I think, as we talk more and more about autonomous cars and robo taxis and whether they have LiDAR or not, I think two things are happening. Musk is going to come in with his version of the, optical sensor robo taxi that is, relatively safe during the day, questionable
Hmm.
at night. The
Hmm.
cost of LiDAR is going to continue to come down. So I think we'll meet somewhere in the middle. But again, and I've said this to Rob, I don't think that meeting, I said this on another podcast today. I think we will have wide adoption of urban air mobility before we have wide adoption of fully autonomous cars.
I agree.
And
Well, there's actually less traffic up there, so
Yeah,
in theory, it's simpler.
that whole
yeah,
other dimension helps too.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you remember the thing I mentioned a few minutes ago about swarm? That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Get all the cars talking to each other. Realistically, you could, have them all run down the road sideways. They can platoon. They can do whatever they do.
Yeah.
We don't have that. So you're trying to constantly counter that lack of capability with technology and AI and everything else. But do you get where you want to go? I just don't think so. There's Scott. You know what I would say? There's a lot of this. It came to me too when I was traveling in Europe last week. There's a lot of brokenness in the transit system. And even when I got to an airport, I came into one of the outer line airports in Italy, and it was $100 Uber ride to downtown to Milan. Trains were not running all the time. It just gets to be a problem. I ended up renting a car because the car cost me
Yeah.
$130 for 5 days. So, I still bought a car. Still rented a car, even though I didn't want to.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think when I look at I live in Valencia, Spain, and I've spoken prolifically about how this is a transportation utopia here.
Mhm.
We have 3 dockless electric moped services. The city government are actively discouraging private car ownership. We have excellent public transit to the
Mhm.
airports, all of these things. But I think this is the beginning of a very good model for pretty much everywhere else where we're dealing in densely populated urban areas. And Rob will be very surprised to hear me say this. If you don't live in a densely populated urban area, you need a car. Like, you need access to a car pretty much anytime you want, because to your point, it's not going to be cost effective. That said, I think, and what I'm trying to do, and we don't have to talk too much about Clover, but what I'm trying to do is prove out that in a densely populated urban area, you don't need a car. And I think if we can solve for that, it starts to get us closer to a wider adoption of transportation as a service in other places, because that becomes, hey, I see these people doing it. I convinced my buddy Rob, who is a carophile, obsessed with cars, to get rid of his private car ownership. I think people start to say, okay, you know what? I think this is a viable possibility for me. And that will be when we start to see those costs come down. I do think eventually for things like Waymo, the costs will come down because the cost of LiDAR is coming down. I mean, you were making this point so well earlier about hi-fi. When I was buying LiDAR technology 15 years ago, for all kinds of autonomous applications, the cheapest one you could get that was of any fidelity was like $30,000.
Mhm.
And now, you can go on Timo and buy one for $200. It's not the same fidelity, but like, damn,
It does
you can get
something.
you can get LiDAR on Amazon now. It's
Yeah.
wild to me. And so I think, listen, we're going to get there in major urban areas. It will come to everyone. And this is another thing that I like to talk about when I'm speaking about OEMs. They're terrified of this. They don't want to encourage this. This is terrible for their bottom line because
Yeah.
it just means less cars. And
Yeah.
it's why I'm able to have conversations with OEMs about investing in a bicycle company, because they know they need to diversify. And that's, at least they're starting to recognize that. I think that's just the very first step in getting them to say, look, there are going to be less cars. How do we continue to be a viable business in the future?
Well, I
Mhm.
also think that Tesla's, trillion-dollar valuation is really based on this as well. Conceivably, it's gonna be hard for many people to walk away from car ownership. But truly, if you do have a network of autonomous vehicles that are available on demand, and, once again, the economics seem to make sense with the robo taxi, and this is V1. If you truly can grab a car as you need it and it takes you to your destination economically, then maybe, just maybe, this is what we need, and supplemented by all the other services such as scooters and
Mhm.
mopeds and public transportation. And then you can kind of get into the suburbs and exurbia as well,
Mhm.
potentially, and consider a life without car ownership. It's conceivable now, at least.
Yeah. Well, give me an example. I'm out here. I moved out to the country. I mean, I'm out in the Ocala forest in Florida now. But what's fascinating is that we've actually got train out to here. I am 10 minutes from the train station. And then that train station can take me down to downtown Orlando. And again, we have a broken piece here. Should be able to take me straight to the airport, but it doesn't. There's a shuttle transfer with regular car, truck. And then you get on and you can go to Miami even now on the same train. Those last miles that are the problem, and they always have been. And if you conceivably could have a cheap service to get me from my house to the train station for winning, it'll take time. I think to your point, Scott, I think it'll happen. And there are places where you won't need a vehicle. I agree. This is the same problem we ran into with EV though. EV tries to be a one size fits all solution. That's for everybody. And when you try to force it, then you lose the good in it. I always say, like, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I was saying this about EV 5 years ago. I'm like, don't push so hard, guys. Let the technology mature, let it evolve, let people bring it into their home, have it as a second vehicle. They'll love it. So it'll make great sense. I mean, for me, it makes great sense to get an EV and go to the grocery store, come back, never burn any fuel. I'll take my motor. But but the point is that there are ways to make this happen.
Yeah, and I think along the same lines here, level 5 autonomy, which is obviously the last piece of the puzzle. It's that last mile part of the equation, and that really requires level 5 autonomy, which is what the robo taxi supposedly is trying to achieve. Is that a distant dream, or is that really going to happen?
Well, you're going to see testing again in the urban areas. I think that's where it'll start. But it's funny to discuss. But actually, I think that autonomous vehicles probably do better in the exurban country areas than they would do actually in the urban, because there's too much going on in urban environment to deal with, cope with. Even we've heard of like wherever wet cement stuck. uh, this opportunity that I was just speaking about, this last few miles to the train station, why not test it there? Why not test it where there's not a lot of people, but they could benefit by connecting to more mass transit type systems? I think you could do that, and I'm pretty positive you could run, level 4, level 5 here in that type of area without so much complication. But we have to see what happens. I think that it's going to happen. I mean, don't get me wrong, the technology is going to speed up. As Scott mentioned, it's going to get cheaper. We've even talked, Scott, we were talking about, like e-bikes and things like that. We've even seen a lot of this technology come into play in the motorcycle space, stuff. And, we've seen bikes that can self-balance, that won't fall over. We've seen bikes that can be tied into the smart city world, into the B2X type world, right? So you'll whack right into us and knock us into the ditch. So the technology is coming. It's just a matter of how fast it comes. And as I always say, how fast can you monetize? Because this is
Yeah.
where the challenge is. You can't monetize. It doesn't matter. You can build the best, but if you can't monetize it, nobody's going to stick.
Awesome. All right, let's bring it home right now. Michael, I love your insight here, and we'd love to have you on the show again. Can
Sure.
you do us a favor and just let the listeners at home know where they can find you online?
Sure. My Substack, you can search it, Michael Entner Gomez. You'll find me there. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I have a website, which is much in progress. I haven't really done much with it because people don't look there too much anymore, but here.com.
Michael, thank you so much. Scott, thank you as well.
My pleasure as always.
A reminder for everyone else to follow us on LinkedIn, like and subscribe to the podcast, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Your review or feedback is always appreciated. Any subject you'd like us to cover, just leave it in the comments below. We will see you all next week with a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.